It was a cold and breezy fall evening in the small town of Harper's Crossing. Nestled among the rolling hills, the town had always been a quiet one, where everyone knew each other, and secrets were rare. The community had its routines, its traditions, and its strong faith. At the center of it all was St. Peter's Church, a place that had seen generations of families come and go. For many, the church was more than just a place to worship. It was a symbol of stability and trust. In this town, there was one figure everyone respected, Father Thomas Richardson. At 45, he had been the parish priest for over 15 years. He was kind-hearted, with a calm demeanor that put everyone at ease. His sermons were always well received, and his ability to counsel people through difficult times made him a pillar of the community. Little did anyone know, Father Thomas was hiding a dark secret that no one could ever have imagined. At 18 years old, Emily Dawson had just finished high school. She was smart, pretty, and a bit of an introvert. Her friends often described her as quiet, but with an inner strength that most people didn't see. Emily lived with her grandmother after her parents had died in a car accident when she was just a child. While she had always been raised in the church, she had never been particularly religious. But when she started attending Father Thomas's youth counseling sessions, something changed. Father Thomas had taken a special interest in Emily. She would sit in the back row during his counseling sessions, listening intently as he spoke about faith, morality, and the teachings of the church. Over time, the two began spending more time together, talking about things outside of the church's walls. Father Thomas seemed to understand Emily in a way no one else did. He listened without judgment, and she began to trust him. What started as innocent conversations soon evolved into something deeper. Emily found herself drawn to Father Thomas in ways she couldn't explain. There was a sense of comfort in his presence, a warmth that she hadn't felt before. And then one night, as they walked through the empty church after a youth event, something happened. The chemistry between them shifted. The conversation became more intimate, more personal. Before she knew it, their hands brushed, and that simple touch ignited something inside Emily. It was a mistake. She knew it. But when Father Thomas leaned in and kissed her, she didn't pull away. She didn't want to. She was lost in the moment, in the warmth of his embrace. They pulled away, both breathless, but neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and a realization they both feared. The secret affair between Emily Dawson and Father Thomas Richardson began in that moment. In the days that followed, Emily struggled with the conflicting emotions that consumed her. She knew it was wrong, but the connection she shared with Father Thomas felt undeniable. They continued to meet in secret, their moments of intimacy hidden from the world. Emily's heart ached with guilt, but she couldn't help herself. She was in love with him, or at least she believed she was. Father Thomas, on the other hand, was battling his own demons. As a priest, he had sworn an oath of celibacy, an oath he had always held sacred. But with Emily, everything felt different. She was young, beautiful, and full of life. She made him feel things he had long since buried. Their secret meetings became more frequent, their stolen moments more intense. But Father Thomas knew that if anyone found out, his life would be ruined. The church would never forgive him. The town would never forgive him. As the days turned into weeks, Emily became more desperate for their relationship to go public. She loved Father Thomas, and she couldn't stand the secrecy anymore. She dreamed of a future where they could be together, openly and without shame. But Father Thomas remained hesitant. He knew the consequences would be disastrous. He warned her that their relationship could never be anything more than what it was, a secret. But Emily refused to accept that. She was young, and she was determined to fight for what she believed in. She confronted Father Thomas, telling him that they couldn't go on living this lie. She wanted him to leave the priesthood, to choose her over everything else. Father Thomas, torn between his love for her and his loyalty to the church, hesitated. He knew what it would cost him, but the temptation to be with Emily was too strong. Then one fateful night, everything changed. Emily arrived at the church, excited to meet Father Thomas after his evening mass. But when she walked into the rectory, she found him sitting in a chair, his head in his hands. There was something different about him, something unsettling. She rushed to his side, asking him what was wrong, but he just shook his head. "I can't do this anymore, Emily," Father Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "I can't lose everything I've worked for. I can't lose my faith." Emily's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, but she wasn't ready for it. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saying it's over," he said quietly, his eyes filled with regret. "We can't keep doing this. It's wrong. It was wrong from the start." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she realized the truth. The man she loved, the man she thought would choose her, was letting her go. In that moment, something inside her snapped. She couldn't handle the pain, the betrayal. She loved him, and he was pushing her away. With a sudden, violent outburst, Emily grabbed the nearby letter opener from the desk and plunged it into Father Thomas's chest. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. But before he could say anything, he collapsed in a heap on the floor. Emily stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands shaking as blood pooled around the priest's body. In the silence that followed, Emily realized what she had done. The quiet town of Harper's Crossing would never be the same again, and neither would Emily. The small town of Harper's Crossing woke up to a chilling reality the morning after Father Thomas's death. News of the murder spread like wildfire through the close-knit community. For the residents of Harper's Crossing, the idea of a beloved parish priest being murdered in his own church seemed unfathomable. The townspeople could not comprehend how a man so trusted, so well-regarded, could meet such a tragic and violent end. They were all asking the same question: who would want to kill Father Thomas? Within hours of the discovery, the local police department, headed by seasoned investigator Detective Sarah McAllister, began their work. Detective McAllister, a sharp, no-nonsense officer with over 15 years of experience, had seen her share of tragedies in her career, but nothing had prepared her for the murder of a priest, especially one that seemed so personal. She arrived at the scene early just as the sun began to rise, casting a gray light over the church's stained glass windows. The crime scene was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding just outside the church's doors. The church's sacristy was where the murder had taken place, Father Thomas's private study, his sanctuary away from the congregation. Emily Dawson's fingerprints were all over the room, but there was one thing that caught Detective McAllister's attention: the letter opener. The weapon used to kill Father Thomas was simple, yet brutal, and it lay next to his lifeless body. The fact that it was an object commonly found in the priest's study added to the disturbing nature of the crime. It wasn't a random act of violence, it was personal. Whoever had done this had been close to Father Thomas. Detective McAllister surveyed the room with her usual calm demeanor, taking in every detail. The body was positioned awkwardly on the floor, as though Father Thomas had been caught off guard. His face was frozen in a grimace of shock and pain, the life drained from his eyes. There was a pool of blood around him, evidence of the brutality of the attack. But there was no sign of struggle, no broken furniture or knocked over objects. It was as if the priest had been caught off guard and had not even attempted to defend himself. "Who found the body?" Detective McAllister asked, her voice steady as she spoke to Officer Jake Carter, the first responder on the scene. "Her name is Emily Dawson," Officer Carter replied, glancing down at his notepad. "She came by around 6:30 a.m., just after morning mass. She said she'd come to talk to Father Thomas, but when she found him, she screamed. That's when we got the call." Detective McAllister frowned. Emily Dawson. She had heard her name before, but it didn't immediately ring any bells. As the daughter of the late parents who had been active members of the church, Emily had grown up in Harper's Crossing and was known as a quiet, reserved girl. She had been a regular at the church, always present at the youth events and mass, but she had never stood out, until now. Now her name would be forever linked to the murder of Father Thomas. The detective turned to the officers who were photographing the crime scene. "We need to get a statement from her. Also, I want every detail of Father Thomas's personal life. Friends, family, anyone who might have had contact with him in the days leading up to this. If this was personal, we'll need to uncover who he was close to." As the investigation moved forward, the detectives learned more about the secretive nature of Father Thomas's life. No one had any reason to suspect anything unusual about his behavior. He had maintained a good reputation in the town and was well liked by both the parishioners and the staff. His actions and sermons had always seemed consistent with the expectations of a priest. But the deeper Detective McAllister dug, the more she realized that there were cracks in the facade, cracks that no one had noticed before. The first person they interviewed was Emily Dawson. She had been the one to find Father Thomas's body, and her account of the events was crucial. When the detective sat her down in a small room at the local police station, she seemed both distraught and composed at the same time. "I came by to talk to Father Thomas," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We'd been meeting for a while, just talking about life. I thought he was going to tell me something important today, but when I walked in, I found him like that." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I didn't know what to do. I called the police." Detective McAllister studied Emily closely. Her story was consistent, but there was something off about her demeanor. It wasn't that she seemed suspicious. She just didn't seem as shocked as someone who had discovered a murder would be. The detective filed that away in her mind. "You mentioned that you and Father Thomas had been meeting. Can you tell me more about that?" Detective McAllister asked, her tone gentle but probing. Emily hesitated for a moment before responding. "We talked about a lot of things. He helped me understand faith, life. I guess I confided in him. We had a lot of deep conversations, but I never thought anything like this could happen." She paused, swallowing hard. "Father Thomas was a good man. He helped me. He helped a lot of people." The detective was unconvinced. It sounded too rehearsed. "Had you seen Father Thomas the night before? Was there anything unusual about his behavior?" She pressed. Emily shifted in her seat, looking down at her hands. He was fine. He seemed normal. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary." Detective McAllister's mind was racing. Emily's story was plausible, but there was one detail that stuck out. Emily had been in Father Thomas's life recently, and their relationship seemed to have been closer than a typical parishioner-priest connection. Could it be that the two had been involved in something more than just counseling? And could that involvement have led to something more dangerous? As Emily was escorted out of the room, Detective McAllister made a note of her reactions, her body language, and her words. Something doesn't add up here. The next step in the investigation was to delve deeper into Father Thomas's personal life. The detectives spoke to members of the church staff, and they soon discovered something surprising. Father Thomas had been particularly close to Emily in the past few months. Several people recalled seeing them together, often speaking privately after Mass, exchanging glances that seemed more intimate than the usual priest-parishioner relationship. Detective McAllister's gut told her that the connection between Emily and Father Thomas wasn't just about faith. There was something more, something hidden in the shadows, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the path to finding the murderer would be far more complex than anyone had anticipated. But Detective McAllister was ready. She knew that unraveling the truth would take time, patience, and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the secrets buried in the quiet town of Harper's Crossing. As the investigation into Father Thomas's death unfolded, Detective McAllister was growing more and more convinced that Emily Dawson held the key to understanding the motive behind the murder. Her behavior had been too calm, too rehearsed for someone who had just discovered a brutal crime. The detective's instincts told her that there was more to Emily's connection with Father Thomas than met the eye, and she needed to dig deeper. That afternoon, Detective McAllister visited the Dawson family home. Emily's grandmother, a frail woman in her late 70s, opened the door with a confused look on her face. She was a devout woman, known for attending Mass regularly, and it was clear from her demeanor that she was shaken by the events surrounding her granddaughter's involvement in the murder. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Dawson," Detective McAllister began, her tone soft but firm. "I just need to ask you a few questions about Emily. Can we talk?" The elderly woman invited the detective inside, and they sat at a small kitchen table, the aroma of fresh baked bread filling the air. Mrs. Dawson was quiet at first, wringing her hands nervously. She hadn't fully understood the gravity of the situation, But now, with the detective's presence, she began to feel the weight of it all. "Is Emily in some kind of trouble, Detective?" Mrs. Dawson asked, her voice shaky. "She's always been such a good girl. I don't understand why this is happening. I'm afraid Emily may know more than she's letting on about what happened to Father Thomas," McAllister replied carefully. "Can you tell me anything about their relationship? I understand she attended his counseling sessions. Did she ever mention anything unusual?" Mrs. Dawson's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something passing across her face that McAllister couldn't quite place. She hesitated before answering. "They had a special bond, I suppose," Mrs. Dawson said slowly, looking down at her hands. "But that's all. Emily has always been a quiet girl. I don't think she had much of a life outside of the church. She'd often go to Father Thomas for guidance, especially after her parents died. I know she respected him, maybe even looked up to him more than she should have. But as far as I know, it was just a friendship." The detective nodded, not entirely convinced by the elderly woman's words. Emily's growing attachment to Father Thomas seemed deeper than just a friendship. McAllister had learned that Emily had visited Father Thomas regularly in recent months, even staying after Mass to speak with him privately. There had to be something more. "I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Dawson, but I need to ask you one more thing. Has Emily ever mentioned anything about Father Thomas that seemed out of the ordinary? Any feelings or emotions she expressed towards him that seemed unusual?" Mrs. Dawson's face twisted with confusion, and for a moment McAllister wondered if the elderly woman was hiding something herself. She opened her mouth to speak but then closed it, as though she had just realized something. "There was one thing," she said hesitantly, her voice lower than before. "About 2 months ago, Emily came to me in tears. She didn't tell me much, but I remember her saying that Father Thomas had become distant. She said he had started avoiding her, and that he seemed conflicted. I asked her if something had happened, but she just told me that she was going to talk to him about it. I didn't press her further." McAllister's heart sank as she processed this new information. It confirmed what she had suspected. Emily had been emotionally invested in Father Thomas far more than anyone had known, and there had been tension, emotional turmoil, that had been building over the past few months. "Thank you, Mrs. Dawson. I'm sorry to have to ask you these questions, but your help is invaluable. I'll be in touch if I need any more information." As McAllister left the Dawson house, she felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place. Emily had been struggling with her feelings for Father Thomas. But what had caused the priest to distance himself from her? What had caused him to suddenly reject her when she seemed to be so deeply in love with him? Was this the catalyst for what had ultimately led to Father Thomas's murder? The investigation now had more questions than answers, and Detective McAllister was determined to find the truth. Later that afternoon, McAllister and her team began to look into Father Thomas's past, hoping to uncover anything that might shed light on the priest's personal life. They spoke with members of the church staff, including Sister Mary, the head of the church's women's ministry, who had worked closely with Father Thomas for many years. Sister Mary was shocked by the news of his death and seemed genuinely distraught. However, as McAllister questioned her, the nun's answers began to reveal inconsistencies that gave the detective pause. "Father Thomas was such a good man," Sister Mary said, wiping away a tear. "He had such a strong sense of duty. We all loved him. He was more than just a priest to us. He was like a brother. We never once suspected that he was hiding anything." "Had there been any signs recently that something was troubling him?" McAllister asked. Sister Mary hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Now that you mention it, I did notice that Father Thomas had been distant lately. He seemed preoccupied, distracted even. There was something in his eyes, a sadness. But I chalked it up to the pressures of running a church. We all have our struggles." McAllister's instincts kicked in once again. Sister Mary's words sounded genuine, but the detective was growing more suspicious. There was something she wasn't saying, something more that could explain the priest's strange behavior. The investigation team then turned their attention to Father Thomas's finances. They found nothing particularly out of the ordinary, except for one small detail. A sizable sum of money had been withdrawn from the church's bank account in the days leading up to his death. The withdrawal had been made by Father Thomas himself, and the transaction was marked as personal. The detective felt a knot form in her stomach. Father Thomas had kept his financial dealings private, but this withdrawal seemed too significant to ignore. What had he needed the money for, and why had he kept it hidden? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in unexpected ways. As the days went on, the investigation took more unexpected turns. Emily Dawson was becoming more and more entrenched in the case, and the investigation into Father Thomas's private life was revealing uncomfortable truths about his emotional state before his death. But one thing was clear: there was more to Father Thomas's relationship with Emily than anyone had suspected, and it would take everything McAllister had to uncover the truth. Emily had become a central figure in this tangled web of lies, emotions, and hidden desires, and Detective McAllister was determined to unravel every secret, no matter how dark, to bring justice for Father Thomas. The case had quickly become more complicated than Detective McAllister had ever anticipated. Every lead seemed to circle back to Emily Dawson. The young girl who had once seemed so innocuous, so innocent, was now at the center of a web that was far murkier than anyone had imagined. Her deep emotional attachment to Father Thomas had clearly crossed some boundaries. But what had driven her to murder? What was the motive? McAllister sat in her office, reviewing the case files late into the night. A murder was always tragic, but this case was different. It wasn't just a senseless killing. The details pointed to something far more personal, more intimate. And that's what bothered McAllister the most. This was no random act. Whoever killed Father Thomas had a connection with him. It was something that had been building for a while, something that had escalated to violence. Emily had been the first one to discover the body, but there was still so much she wasn't saying. McAllister couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was hiding something, something that could explain the reason behind the murder. But what could it be? What had happened between Emily and Father Thomas? The next step in the investigation was to confront Emily again, this time with more specific questions. McAllister had to get to the truth, to dig deep into Emily's past, to understand the dynamics between her and the priest. But this time, the detective wasn't going to let Emily's calm demeanor fool her. She was determined to crack the wall of silence the young girl had built around herself. The following morning, McAllister met with her team and outlined her plan. They would bring Emily in for another interview, but this time they would be prepared. They had already begun digging into her past, her relationship with Father Thomas, her family history, and her mental state in the months leading up to the murder. They had also subpoenaed her phone records and social media activity. They would know if she was hiding something. When Emily arrived at the police station later that day, she looked like a shell of the girl she had been just a few days ago. Her face was pale, her eyes red from lack of sleep, and her posture slouched as if the weight of the world was bearing down on her. McAllister could see the anxiety in her eyes, but there was also something else, something guarded. Emily was hiding something, and McAllister was determined to find out what it was. "Emily," McAllister began gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you more questions. I need you to be honest with me." Emily nodded, though her lips trembled. "I'm telling you the truth, detective. I don't know who did this. I just found him. I don't know what happened." McAllister took a deep breath and decided to shift tactics. "I know you were very close to Father Thomas. You said that you had deep conversations with him, that you confided in him. I've spoken to some people who've said that your relationship with him might have been more than just spiritual. Is that true?" Emily's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, McAllister could see the walls come up. The young girl's face flushed with a mix of confusion and discomfort, but there was no denial. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, staring at the table in front of her. I don't know what you mean," Emily replied quietly. "People have said you were spending a lot of time with him," McAllister continued, her voice steady, "that you were more than just a parishioner, more than just a girl seeking guidance. They said you seemed very close. Too close." Emily was silent for a long moment, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked up at McAllister, her eyes filled with an emotion McAllister couldn't place. Was it guilt? Shame? Fear? "Father Thomas was my mentor. Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He helped me after my parents died. He was always there for me. I didn't have anyone else. We, we talked about everything. McAllister leaned forward, her voice softer now. And that's when things started to change, didn't they? When Father Thomas started pulling away, when he became distant. Why? Emily's eyes welled up with tears. I don't know. I just don't know. He started avoiding me. He would tell me that I needed to focus on my faith, that I needed to find my own path. He said I was too dependent on him. Emily paused, taking a shaky breath. But I wasn't. I just, I just wanted someone to listen. McAllister could see the conflict in Emily's eyes. The girl had clearly been emotionally invested in the priest. But McAllister needed to know what had caused the rift. What had triggered Father Thomas to distance himself from Emily? Emily, McAllister said softly, was there ever anything more than friendship between you and Father Thomas? Emily looked away, unable to meet the detective's gaze. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then slowly, Emily spoke. I loved him, she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to, but I loved him. And when he started pushing me away, I couldn't understand why. I thought we were connected, but he didn't feel the same way. He never did. Detective McAllister's heart sank. This was it. Emily had fallen in love with Father Thomas, and he had rejected her. But the rejection hadn't been just about love. It was something deeper, something tied to the priest's own personal demons. I tried to talk to him, Emily continued, her voice breaking. I tried to tell him how I felt, but he kept avoiding me. He said I needed to focus on my relationship with God. But I couldn't just forget. I couldn't. I needed him. McAllister's mind was racing. Emily had been emotionally unstable. But had her feelings for Father Thomas escalated into something dangerous? Had she snapped, unable to handle the rejection, and killed him in a moment of rage? Tell me about the night he died, McAllister asked. What happened when you found his body? Emily's face drained of color as she relived the moment. I went to see him. I wanted to talk to him one last time. I needed closure. But when I walked into the sacristy, he was already dead. I didn't know what to do. I was in shock. I didn't know who to call. And then, I called the police. Detective McAllister's suspicion grew. Emily's behavior seemed more and more like the actions of someone who was trying to cover their tracks. She wasn't showing the typical shock or grief of someone who had just found a murder victim. There was something else, something far more sinister at play. Emily, do you understand what you're saying? McAllister asked softly, watching the girl closely. Do you understand that your feelings for Father Thomas might have led to this? That you may have hurt him? Emily closed her eyes tightly, her face twisted with guilt. I didn't mean to, she sobbed. I never meant to hurt him, but I just wanted him to love me. I couldn't stand it anymore. McAllister sat back, her heart heavy with the weight of the young girl's words. It seemed that Emily had been consumed by her feelings for the priest, feelings that had spiraled out of control. The detective wasn't ready to make any conclusions just yet, but it was clear that Emily Dawson's emotional turmoil had played a crucial role in Father Thomas's tragic death. The search for motive had led McAllister to a devastating conclusion. This wasn't just a murder. It was the tragic result of a young girl's obsessive love, rejection, and deep emotional pain. But was this all there was to the story? Or was there more hidden beneath the surface? Detective McAllister sat at her desk, her mind still reeling from Emily Dawson's confession. She had been so close to cracking the case, yet there were still too many unanswered questions. Was Emily the murderer? Did her unrequited love for Father Thomas lead her to kill him? The emotions Emily had described were raw, and the detective could almost feel the depth of the girl's pain. But McAllister was a seasoned investigator. She knew better than to accept a confession at face value. There was something off about Emily's story, the way she hesitated before answering certain questions, the gaps in her memory, the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit perfectly. McAllister had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts were telling her that there was more to this than met the eye. McAllister decided to revisit the crime scene. The church had been quiet, still, when she had visited it days ago. But there was something about revisiting it now that felt important. Perhaps there was a detail she had missed, something that could point to a different suspect, a new lead. The priest's office, where the murder had taken place, had been locked off since the investigation began. The small, dark room where Father Thomas had been found was cluttered with religious artifacts and a few personal belongings. Nothing that seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. But McAllister knew that sometimes the smallest detail could be the one that unlocked everything. As she walked through the sacristy, McAllister's thoughts circled back to one nagging detail. Emily had told her she called the police immediately after finding Father Thomas's body. But why hadn't she tried to administer CPR? Why hadn't she attempted anything to save him if she was so distraught over his death? It didn't make sense. She stepped inside the room again, her eyes scanning the space. There was something that struck her as odd. The chair Father Thomas had been sitting in when he was murdered had been overturned. The desk was knocked sideways, papers scattered everywhere as if there had been a struggle. But where was the blood? Father Thomas had been stabbed, but there was no blood splatter in the room, no sign of violent struggle around the area where he had been found. McAllister's heart began to race as she examined the crime scene from a different angle. Could Emily have been telling the truth, or was she covering for someone else? Just then, McAllister's phone buzzed. It was her team. They had something new. The lab had found traces of a strange substance on Father Thomas's desk. It wasn't blood. It wasn't even a typical fingerprint or DNA trace. It was a chemical compound used in cleaning products, the kind of substance commonly used in hospitals or places where there's heavy sanitation. McAllister knew immediately what this meant. Someone had been there before Emily arrived. Someone had cleaned up the scene to make it look like a random murder. It clicked in McAllister's mind. The priest had been murdered before Emily found him, and whoever had killed him had tried to stage the scene to make it look like Emily had stumbled upon the crime. McAllister rushed back to the station to meet with her team. She needed to dig deeper into Emily's background and see if anyone else from the church had been involved with her and Father Thomas. But first, McAllister needed to go back to the one person she had avoided for too long. Father Thomas's best friend, Father Michael Westbrook. Father Westbrook had been Father Thomas's closest confidant. The two had worked together for years, and McAllister had heard whispers of a potential falling out between them months before the murder. Emily had mentioned how Father Thomas had begun pulling away from her, focusing more on his faith and distancing himself from his former friends. What if this had been the cause of the tension between the two priests? What if Father Westbrook had been involved in something darker, something that had pushed Father Thomas to the brink? McAllister met with Father Michael Westbrook at the church later that evening. The older priest seemed calm, almost too calm for someone whose best friend had just been murdered. His face remained unreadable as McAllister sat down across from him, staring at him intently. Father Westbrook, I need to ask you some questions about Father Thomas, McAllister said, her voice firm. Father Westbrook nodded. I understand, Detective. It's hard to believe he's gone. We had our differences, but we were like brothers. I'm sure you were. But I've heard that you and Father Thomas had been growing apart recently. Is that true? Father Westbrook shifted in his seat, looking down at his hands. Yes, it's true. We had a falling out, but it wasn't anything major. It was just a difference of opinion on some of the church's policies. But that's all it was. McAllister studied him closely. There was something in his eyes, something that made her uneasy. Was it guilt, regret, or was it just grief? Do you think Father Thomas might have been involved with someone he shouldn't have been? McAllister asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. Father Westbrook looked up sharply, his eyes wide with shock. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking if you knew about any relationship, perhaps with a parishioner, that could have caused trouble. Father Westbrook's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're getting at, but I'll tell you this. Father Thomas was a good man. He would never do anything to hurt anyone. He was a man of faith. McAllister didn't believe him. There was something off in his tone, the way he was so quick to defend Father Thomas's character. It was as if he was overcompensating for something. McAllister pressed on. What was the nature of your disagreement with Father Thomas? Was it really just about church policies? Father Westbrook seemed to hesitate for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window before returning to McAllister. We disagreed on the way the church should be run. Father Thomas was becoming more conservative. He wanted the church to return to old traditions, old ways of doing things. I didn't share that vision, but that's all it was. I swear. McAllister leaned forward, her voice low and serious. Do you have any idea who might want to hurt him? Someone who was close to him? Someone who might have resented him for rejecting them? Father Westbrook's eyes flickered nervously. For a moment, it seemed like he might crack, like he might reveal something. But then he quickly regained his composure. I don't know. I really don't know. I'm just as devastated as anyone else. McAllister wasn't convinced. She had a nagging suspicion that Father Westbrook knew more than he was letting on. She had to find a way to dig deeper into his past, into his relationship with Father Thomas. She needed to uncover the truth. As McAllister left the church that night, she felt the case was on the verge of breaking wide open. The pieces were falling into place, but they weren't quite fitting yet. Emily's confession didn't make sense in light of the new evidence. Someone else had been involved, and that someone was hiding something. Something big. The truth was getting closer, but McAllister knew it wasn't going to be easy. There were still many layers to peel away before the final piece of the puzzle would be revealed. Detective McAllister sat at her desk late into the night, sifting through the files before her. She had the confession of Emily Dawson, the strange chemical traces found at the crime scene, and Father Westbrook's unsettling behavior. Yet despite all the evidence, there was a gap, a missing link that still eluded her. Everything pointed in different directions, but nothing connected the dots completely. As McAllister ran her fingers over the case files, she couldn't shake the feeling that the key to solving the case was buried within the seemingly unrelated details. The argument between the priests, the quiet tension in the church, and Emily's relationship with Father Thomas. Something was amiss, and McAllister wasn't one to leave a case unsolved. The pieces were finally coming together. The phone on her desk buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was her colleague, Officer Hernandez, with a new lead. The lab results had come back from the blood samples taken from Emily's clothing. It wasn't Father Thomas's blood, at least not entirely. The tests showed traces of another blood type mixed with the priest's, suggesting that Emily wasn't the only person present at the time of the murder. McAllister's heart raced as she processed the information. That was the breakthrough she needed. Someone else had been there, and they had been involved in the crime. She quickly grabbed her jacket and headed to the station to meet Hernandez. When she arrived, Hernandez handed her a set of files, his expression grim. We've traced the other blood sample. It belongs to Father Michael Westbrook. McAllister stared at Hernandez, stunned. She had suspected that Westbrook was hiding something, but this confirmation was far more than she had expected. The priest, the man who had been close to Father Thomas, the one who had been so defensive of his late friend, he had been at the scene. But why? And why had he not mentioned his presence? The pieces began to fit together. McAllister's mind raced back to Father Westbrook's words during their meeting. He had been so quick to dismiss any suggestion of foul play between him and Father Thomas. He had denied any relationship that could have gone beyond friendship. But now it seemed that denial was a carefully constructed lie. McAllister pulled out Emily's confession again, reading it over with a new perspective. Emily had described the night of the murder in vivid detail, but she had been vague about the events leading up to it. She had claimed to be devastated when she found Father Thomas's body, but McAllister knew now that the murder had occurred long before Emily arrived at the scene. It was clear now that Father Westbrook had been involved in the murder, but the question remained, why would he kill Father Thomas? Was it a crime of passion, or was there something more sinister at play? McAllister decided to confront Father Westbrook one last time. She needed to know everything: his relationship with Father Thomas, his motivations, and whether he had been hiding something darker than a simple disagreement. She was certain he was the key to unraveling the entire case. McAllister arranged for another meeting with Father Westbrook at the church. As she walked into the familiar sacristy, the air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Father Westbrook was sitting in his usual chair, his hands folded neatly on his lap. His calm demeanor had not changed since their last meeting. but McAllister could see the slightest tremor in his fingers, a subtle sign that he was far more rattled than he was letting on. "Father Westbrook," McAllister began, her voice steady but unwavering, "we've found something that ties you to Father Thomas's murder." Father Westbrook looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "We've found traces of your blood at the scene. It's clear you were there the night he died." Westbrook's face paled, and for the first time, McAllister saw something other than calmness in his eyes. Fear. "I didn't kill him," Father Westbrook stammered. "I would never hurt Thomas. He was my closest friend." "Then why were you there?" McAllister pressed, stepping closer to him. "What happened between you and Father Thomas that night?" Father Westbrook's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping. For a moment, McAllister wondered if he was going to remain silent. But then, with a deep sigh, he began to speak, his voice filled with regret. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he whispered. "We had an argument, yes, but it wasn't about the church, or the faith, or any of the things I told you earlier. It was about Emily." McAllister raised an eyebrow. "Emily Dawson?" "Yes," Father Westbrook said, his voice growing quieter. "She was in love with Thomas, but Thomas, he didn't feel the same. He had grown distant, not just from her, but from all of us. He wanted to leave everything behind. His responsibilities as a priest, his friendships, even his connection to the church. He was consumed by his own guilt, and he couldn't see past his own shame." McAllister listened intently as Westbrook continued. "Emily didn't understand. She couldn't accept that Thomas didn't love her back, but she couldn't let him go either. She came to me, asking for advice. She begged me to help her. She said she would do anything to get Thomas's love, even if it meant, well, hurting him." McAllister's heart skipped a beat. "Are you saying Emily was involved in his death?" "No," Westbrook replied quickly, shaking his head. "No, she wasn't. But I couldn't let her go down that path. I tried to talk sense into her. I told her she needed to move on, that Thomas didn't deserve her devotion, but she wouldn't listen. That night, she came to the church, demanding to see Thomas. I tried to stop her, to talk to her, but it was too late." Father Westbrook paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "When I walked into the room, Thomas was already dead. I didn't know how it happened. I don't know if Emily had already gone, or if she had been there when it happened. But I panicked. I knew I couldn't explain everything, so I cleaned up the scene, wiped away the evidence. I didn't want anyone to know that I was there, that I had been part of the whole mess, so I staged it to make it look like a random attack." McAllister's mind was racing as she processed the confession. The truth was finally coming to light, but there was still a piece missing. "What about Emily?" McAllister asked. "What happened to her?" Father Westbrook's face twisted with guilt. "She found the body. She thought she had killed him. She didn't know that I had been there first. I didn't want her to go to jail, so I made her take the blame. I told her she needed to confess, that she had to cover for me. I manipulated her into thinking she was guilty." McAllister's heart sank as she realized the full extent of Westbrook's actions. He hadn't just been involved in the murder. He had used Emily, a vulnerable young girl, as a pawn in his own twisted game. McAllister stood up, her voice cold and resolute. "Father Westbrook, you're under arrest for the murder of Father Thomas, as well as for coercion and obstruction of justice." As Father Westbrook was led away in handcuffs, McAllister couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The truth had finally been uncovered, and the twisted web of lies and manipulation had been unraveled. But the cost was high. Emily Dawson's life had been shattered, and she would never be the same again. The cold steel doors of the county jail creaked open, and Father Michael Westbrook was led inside, his head down, his once pristine white collar now a symbol of the corruption that had festered within him. Detective McAllister stood at the edge of the door, watching the priest being escorted to his cell. Her heart was heavy, the weight of the case settling on her shoulders. She had gotten justice, but there were no winners here, not for Father Thomas, not for Emily, and certainly not for Father Westbrook. As McAllister made her way back to her office, she thought about the girl, Emily Dawson. The 18-year-old had once been full of promise, her life ahead of her. Now, after everything that had happened, She was left to pick up the pieces. Emily's love for Father Thomas, so pure and innocent in the beginning, had turned into something darker, something dangerous, when it became twisted by obsession and manipulation. It was a tragic tale, one of love, betrayal, and loss. McAllister had arranged for Emily to be placed in a psychiatric facility for counseling and care. She had gone through too much to simply be left to fend for herself. The girl needed help, and McAllister was determined to make sure she got it. Emily had confessed to the murder, but McAllister knew that it hadn't been entirely her fault. She had been manipulated, coerced by Father Westbrook into believing she was responsible for something she hadn't done. Emily had spent weeks in prison, tortured by guilt, all because of the lies Father Westbrook had spun. The detective's phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Officer Hernandez, calling to update her on the status of the case. "Detective, we've got some news on Emily," Hernandez said. "She's been released from the psychiatric facility, but she's not the same. She's withdrawn, and she's refusing to speak to anyone about what happened. It's like she's in some sort of trance. We've spoken to the doctors, and they believe it's a result of the trauma." McAllister let out a slow breath. She was never supposed to go through all of this. I don't think anyone really realized the full extent of what was happening until it was too late. Westbrook's manipulation ran deep. "Yeah," Hernandez agreed. "It's a tragedy. All of it. I still don't understand what would drive someone to do that. There's no excuse for what Westbrook did," McAllister replied, her voice low. "But I think he was afraid of losing control. He was afraid of being exposed, afraid of the truth coming out. And in the end, he didn't just destroy Father Thomas, he destroyed Emily too." McAllister hung up, feeling the familiar weight of a case well solved, but incomplete. She had helped expose the truth, but the damage was done. The community would never be the same. The church, a place of faith and refuge, had become a symbol of betrayal and manipulation. No one would be able to walk into those sacred halls without remembering the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. In the weeks following Westbrook's arrest, the media was relentless. The story of a young girl's secret affair with a priest, ending in murder, became national news. The public was shocked, outraged, and saddened by the events. It was a scandal that would haunt the church for years to come. Father Westbrook was a figure once revered by his congregation, a man of God, now revealed to be a predator hiding behind the very thing he was meant to protect. His trial was swift, and he was convicted of first-degree murder, coercion, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emily's trial was a different matter. Despite her confession, the court recognized that she had been manipulated, coerced by Father Westbrook's influence. Her defense team argued that she had not acted of her own free will and that she had been a victim of emotional and psychological abuse. The judge ruled that Emily was not criminally responsible for Father Thomas's death, and instead of facing a prison sentence, she was sent to a rehabilitation center for therapy and treatment. It was a decision that sparked some debate, but McAllister believed it was the right one. Emily had been a victim of circumstance, manipulated by the very person she had trusted. She needed help, not punishment. In the months that followed, McAllister stayed in touch with Emily's doctors, receiving updates on the girl's progress. Slowly she began to heal, though the scars of what had happened would never fully fade. Emily started speaking again, though in fragmented sentences, about the events that led up to Father Thomas's death. She spoke of her love for him, the pain she felt when he rejected her, and the confusion that consumed her when she found him dead. The truth had been buried under layers of guilt, shame, and fear, but eventually Emily began to find peace with herself. It would be a long journey, but McAllister was hopeful that Emily would find a way to move forward. As for the community, the impact of the tragedy rippled through the town. The church was closed for several months for renovations and reorganization, and the congregation struggled to reconcile the man they had once trusted with the man he had become. There was a deep sense of betrayal, a loss of innocence. People questioned everything they had believed in. How could someone they had trusted so completely be capable of such heinous acts? In the end, McAllister knew that the wounds would take time to heal. The church would rebuild, but the scars would always remain. She had solved the case, but there were no simple answers. The human heart was fragile, easily twisted by desires, fears, and obsessions. Emily and Father Thomas's story had been one of love turned toxic, of betrayal and manipulation.